The story of London begins not as the bustling metropolis we know today, but as a modest Roman outpost strategically established in the wake of imperial conquest. In 43 AD, during the reign of Emperor Claudius, the Roman Empire launched a full-scale invasion of Britain, one of the final frontiers in Rome's expansion across Europe. As Roman legions pushed inland, they identified the site along the River Thames as a vital location for military logistics, trade, and administration. It was here that they founded Londinium, a settlement that would serve as the Roman gateway to Britannia. The choice of location was no accident. The Thames, wide and tidal, provided a natural highway deep into the interior of the island and out toward the sea, ideal for transporting goods, troops, and information. The Romans soon constructed a wooden bridge across the Thames, enabling not just military movement, but also economic activity. This bridge marked the birth of London as a crossroads of commerce and empire. From its inception, Londinium was a planned Roman town, built according to the familiar urban layout seen across the empire. At its heart stood the Forum, a central marketplace surrounded by government buildings, temples, and baths. Straight, paved roads connected Londinium to other key Roman settlements, weaving the city into the wider imperial network. The Via Watling, one of Britain's most important Roman roads, ran through Londinium and linked it directly with places like Verulamium, modern St. Albans, and eventually the ports of Kent. In just a few decades, Londinium grew from a military outpost into a thriving urban centre. Merchants, craftsmen, and settlers, both Roman and local, flocked to the city. Villas, warehouses, and shops lined its streets, while ships arrived regularly with goods from across the empire: wine from Gaul, olive oil from Hispania, pottery from Germania. At its height during the 2nd century AD, the city may have held 30,000 to 60,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest towns in Roman Britain. To protect this growing hub, the Romans constructed defensive walls and watchtowers, transforming Londinium into a fortified city. These walls, parts of which are still visible today, mark the city's boundary and symbolize Roman order and authority. The architecture and infrastructure introduced by the Romans, stone buildings, aqueducts, bathhouses, and public latrines, set a new standard of urban life for the island's inhabitants. But Londinium was more than just a Roman town. It was a symbol of Rome's ambition to civilize and control the British Isles. The city functioned as a colonial showcase, radiating Roman culture, law, and language into the surrounding region. Latin inscriptions, Roman coins, and imported luxuries have all been unearthed by archaeologists, providing a vivid glimpse into this early chapter of London's history. Despite later periods of upheaval and destruction, the Roman imprint on the city would endure. The layout of roads, the riverside location, and even the name London itself trace back to this imperial foundation. In many ways, the Romans not only founded Londinium, they laid the structural and cultural groundwork for the global city that London would one day become. Boudica's Revolt and Destruction. Barely 2 decades after its foundation, Londinium faced a cataclysmic event that threatened to erase its early growth. In 60 or 61 AD, during the governorship of Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, Roman Britain was shaken by a large-scale rebellion led by Queen Boudica of the Iceni, a tribe from eastern Britain. The uprising was a direct reaction to Roman mistreatment of native peoples, particularly the brutal annexation of Iceni territory following the death of Boudica's husband, the flogging of the queen herself, and the rape of her daughters. These humiliations ignited deep resentment, and Boudica soon became the figurehead of a coordinated revolt against Roman occupation. The rebellion quickly gathered momentum. As Boudica's army swept across the province, Roman settlements fell, one after another. Camulodunum, modern Colchester, the former Roman capital, was the first to be destroyed, its inhabitants slaughtered. News of the revolt reached Londinium just as it was emerging as a key administrative and commercial center. Governor Suetonius, realizing he could not defend the young settlement with the troops at his disposal, made the grim decision to abandon it. The Roman forces withdrew, leaving the civilian population to fend for themselves. What followed was total devastation. Boudica's forces descended on Londinium and razed it to the ground. Archaeological layers of scorched earth, known today as the Boudican destruction layer, still mark the ferocity of the attack. Buildings were burned, inhabitants massacred, and the infrastructure of the nascent city reduced to rubble. The uprising continued beyond Londinium, laying waste to Verulamium, modern St. Albans, before Roman forces regrouped and ultimately defeated Boudica's army in a decisive battle whose exact location remains uncertain. Though her revolt was quashed, the destruction Boudica inflicted left a deep scar on Roman Britain. Yet, in typical Roman fashion, the response to this disaster was not retreat, but reconstruction. Londinium, despite its total ruin, was deemed too important to abandon. It was quickly rebuilt, this time with stronger defenses and a renewed emphasis on security. A more robust street layout was implemented, administrative buildings were re-established, and eventually a stone wall would encircle the city, serving as both protection and a statement of resilience. The rebellion and its aftermath marked a turning point in Roman policy toward Britain. The brutality of Boudica's revolt demonstrated the dangers of ignoring local tensions, and the Roman administration shifted toward a more pragmatic, if still authoritarian, approach in dealing with the province. For Londinium, the destruction became a foundation myth of sorts, a symbol of vulnerability overcome by Roman tenacity and order. The city that rose from the ashes would not only be larger and stronger, but more central than ever to Roman ambitions in the region. Decline. After Roman withdrawal. By the early 5th century, the once thriving Roman city of Londinium had entered a period of irreversible decline. The Roman Empire, stretched thin by internal strife and external invasions, could no longer maintain its distant provinces. In 410 AD, Emperor Honorius reportedly informed the cities of Britain that they must look to their own defense, effectively marking the end of Roman rule in the region. The legions stationed in Britain were recalled to defend the heartlands of the empire, leaving urban centers like Londinium exposed and unsupported. The consequences were immediate and profound. Londinium, which had served as a vital administrative and commercial hub for centuries, was left without a military presence, central governance, or economic lifeline. Trade with the continent collapsed, Roman coinage ceased to circulate, and the complex systems that had sustained urban life, such as road maintenance, water supply, and public services, began to fall apart. The civic buildings, once bustling with merchants, officials, and citizens, stood silent. Overgrown streets, decaying temples, and crumbling walls became defining features of the deserted cityscape. What followed was not an abrupt destruction, but a slow and steady abandonment. Archaeological evidence shows a marked decline in habitation during the 5th century. The population dwindled, and large portions of the city were simply left to decay. Timber structures rotted, roofs collapsed, and nature reclaimed the carefully planned Roman grid. Unlike other Roman cities in Europe that evolved into medieval urban centers, Londinium was not continuously inhabited. Instead, it became a ghost city. Its imposing walls and broken monuments a haunting reminder of an imperial past now lost. Intriguingly, the incoming Anglo-Saxon settlers, who began arriving in increasing numbers during this period, chose not to inhabit the remains of Londinium. Whether due to superstition, strategic considerations, or simple practicality, the ruins were left largely untouched. Instead, the Anglo-Saxons established new settlements in the surrounding countryside, most notably to the west in an area that would later become known as Lundenwic. The abandoned Roman city, with its massive stone walls and foreign architecture, likely seemed alien and unwelcoming to these new arrivals, whose building traditions and social structures were entirely different. This period of neglect and disuse marked a profound rupture in London's development. For nearly 2 centuries, Londinium remained a relic of the Roman world, isolated from the emerging Anglo-Saxon culture that would eventually shape the medieval landscape of England. Yet, even in abandonment, the legacy of Roman Londinium persisted. Its walls and ruins stood as enduring landmarks, influencing later settlement patterns and serving as a silent witness to the city's future rebirth. What had once been a beacon of Roman civilization had fallen into silence, its streets empty and its temples in ruins. But the story of London was far from over. The decline of Londinium was not an end, but a pause, an interlude between empires waiting for a new chapter to begin. Saxon London. After centuries of abandonment, the silence surrounding the ruins of Roman Londinium began to lift. By the 7th century, the Anglo-Saxons, now the dominant cultural force in the region, established a new settlement nearby, but significantly, not within the decaying Roman walls. Instead, they chose to build roughly a mile to the west, on what is now the area around Covent Garden and the Strand. This new community was called Lundenwic, meaning London Trading Town in Old English, a name that reflected its growing importance as a mercantile centre in early medieval England. The reasons for this shift in location were both practical and cultural. The old Roman city, with its crumbling stone structures and overgrown streets, remained largely avoided. It may have been seen as eerie, cursed, or simply unsuited to the wooden architecture and open settlement style preferred by the Anglo-Saxons. Lundenwic, in contrast, was established on open ground near the Thames, offering easy access to the river and space for expansion. It grew organically, shaped by commerce rather than military planning, and flourished as a port and market town. By the 8th century, Lundenwic had become one of the most important trading hubs in Anglo-Saxon England. Archaeological excavations have uncovered evidence of a bustling riverside community with workshops, dwellings, and warehouses. Imported goods, such as wine from the Frankish kingdoms, glassware from the Rhineland, and pottery from across the Channel, all passed through its markets. Skilled artisans produced metalwork, textiles, and leather goods, while fishermen, farmers, and traders supplied the daily needs of a growing population. Coins minted in the settlement point to its semi-independent economic role within the wider Anglo-Saxon world. Despite the apparent prosperity, Lundenwic lacked the defensive infrastructure of its Roman predecessor. It was a town built for trade, not war, an openness that would soon prove a vulnerability. In the late 8th century, the first Viking raiders began to appear on the coasts of Britain. These initial attacks were sporadic, but by the mid-9th century they had grown into sustained campaigns of plunder and occupation. Lundenwic, with its wealth and poor defences, became a natural target. The Viking incursions brought violence and uncertainty to daily life. Settlements were attacked, people enslaved or killed, and trade routes disrupted. As raids intensified, the residents of Lundenwic faced a stark choice: adapt or flee. The answer, ultimately, came in the form of strategic retreat. Under the guidance of King Alfred the Great, the population was relocated in the late 9th century back to the fortified Roman site, now repaired and renamed Lundenburg. The Roman walls, once abandoned, were restored to serve as a bulwark against the Norse threat. The Saxon period thus saw the rebirth of London not on its ancient ruins, but beside them. Lundenwich was a vital chapter in the city's re-emergence, an era of commerce, growth, and interaction with continental Europe. Though overshadowed by the chaos that followed, it laid the groundwork for the medieval city to come. As London's riverside bustled with trade and its name re-entered written history, the foundations were quietly being laid for its transformation from Saxon market town to enduring capital. Viking attacks and Alfred the Great's defense. By the latter half of the 9th century, the Viking presence in Britain had escalated from sporadic raids to full-scale invasions and settlements. The so-called Great Heathen Army, a large coalition of Norse warriors, began its campaigns in 865 AD, sweeping through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms with brutal efficiency. Towns were sacked, monasteries looted, and whole regions brought under Scandinavian control. Lundenwich, the once thriving Saxon trading settlement by the Thames, found itself increasingly vulnerable. Open and undefended, it became a prime target for Viking attacks, and its prosperity quickly declined under the weight of constant threat. Faced with this mounting crisis, leadership became paramount. It was under Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, that a decisive and strategic response emerged. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Alfred recognized that the only way to halt the Viking advance was through fortified resistance and calculated urban planning. In the 800s and 80s, following a series of military victories and a truce with Viking forces, Alfred took the bold step of reoccupying the old Roman city, long abandoned since the early 5th century. The once ruined Londinium, with its towering stone walls and defensive potential, was brought back to life under a new name, Lundenburh. Alfred's decision was both practical and symbolic. The Roman walls, though aged, offered a solid foundation for defense. He ordered repairs and reinforcements, transforming the site into a burh, a fortified town meant to withstand Viking incursions and serve as a base for royal authority. The Thames side location allowed for control over river traffic, while the walled perimeter offered security for residents, merchants, and the growing administration. This was not merely a military maneuver, it was the beginning of a permanent urban revival. The re-establishment of Lundenburh under Alfred's rule marked a turning point in the city's history. The population from Lundenwich migrated back within the walls, settling once again among the remnants of the Roman past. Streets were cleared, new timber buildings erected, and trade slowly resumed under the protective shadow of the city's defenses. Lundenburh became a symbol of resistance, not just against the Norse, but against the broader chaos that had engulfed Anglo-Saxon England. Alfred's policy of building and restoring burhs across his kingdom, of which Lundenburh was a key example, created a network of strong points that checked Viking expansion and fostered the re-emergence of urban life. These fortified centers enabled secure markets, protected churches, and offered administrative coherence in a time of disorder. London, under its revived form, began to regain its status as a regional hub. Though the threat from the Vikings would persist for generations, Alfred's defense of London laid the groundwork for its medieval ascent. By reclaiming the old Roman heart of the city, he not only ensured its survival, but reshaped its destiny. What had once been a forgotten ruin became, once again, a stronghold of power and continuity. Lundenburh, the resilient city on the Thames, ready to rise anew. Norman Conquest and the Tower of London. In 1066, a seismic shift occurred in English history. Following the death of Edward the Confessor and the ensuing battle for succession, William, Duke of Normandy, launched an ambitious invasion across the English Channel. His victory at the Battle of Hastings was swift and decisive, culminating in the death of King Harold II and the collapse of Anglo-Saxon resistance. Yet conquest on the battlefield was only the beginning. To secure his hold over a hostile and newly conquered land, William needed to assert both psychological and military dominance, and nowhere was this more crucial than in London. The city, though spared the direct violence of Hastings, was central to England's political and economic life. Its citizens, wary but pragmatic, eventually submitted to William, who was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. However, submission did not equal security. Rebellions simmered across the kingdom, and William moved quickly to entrench Norman control. One of his most enduring strategies was the construction of castles imposing stone fortresses that served as both military strongpoints and visible symbols of foreign rule. In London, this strategy took its most iconic form with the creation of the Tower of London. Shortly after his coronation, William ordered the building of a massive stone keep the White Tower on the eastern edge of the city, near the Thames. Strategically placed both to deter rebellion and to watch over London's river traffic, the tower was the first of its kind in England, a Norman stronghold embedded in the heart of the capital. Constructed on the site of the old Roman walls, the tower served multiple purposes. It was a fortress, designed to withstand siege, a royal residence symbolizing the presence of the king, and a tool of intimidation, casting a long shadow over the city. Built using imported Caen stone from Normandy and constructed under the supervision of Norman architects and engineers, the White Tower was unlike anything the English had seen. Its sheer size and strength communicated the permanence of Norman authority. But the Tower of London was not an isolated project. Its construction marked the beginning of a broader transformation of London's urban and political landscape. Norman nobles were granted lands in and around the city. New churches and religious institutions were established, and Anglo-Saxon elites were systematically replaced or subordinated. French became the language of the court and legal system, intertwining the city with the wider cultural orbit of continental Europe. Despite the initial friction between the Normans and the local population, London itself benefited from the stability and order that William sought to impose. Trade flourished, new infrastructure was developed, and the city's strategic importance only grew. Yet the tower remained a constant reminder of who held ultimate power. Over time, it would evolve into a royal palace, a treasury, a prison, and a place of execution, its identity shifting with the political tides, but its symbolism enduring. The Norman conquest irrevocably altered the fabric of English society, law, and governance. In London, these changes were etched into stone. The tower, rising defiantly from the banks of the Thames, stood not just as a fortress, but as the architectural embodiment of conquest itself. It was the physical declaration of a new order, one that would reshape London and England for centuries to come. The Black Death. In 1348, a shadow fell over London unlike anything it had ever experienced. The Black Death, a deadly outbreak of bubonic plague, swept across Europe with terrifying speed, and by the time it reached England's shores, the devastation was inevitable. Carried by fleas on rats and further spread through the dense and unsanitary urban conditions, the plague tore through the crowded streets of London with catastrophic effect. Within 2 years, nearly half of the city's population, tens of thousands of people, had died. The scale of the loss is difficult to comprehend. Entire households perished within days. Parish records, overwhelmed by the pace of burials, ceased to be maintained in some areas. The city's graveyards overflowed, leading to the creation of mass burial sites. One such location, in what is now East Smithfield, became the final resting place for thousands of victims. The social fabric of London was torn apart. Priests died while administering last rites, physicians proved helpless, and the normal rhythms of daily life came to a halt. Commerce and governance all but collapsed. Markets were abandoned, ships avoided the Thames, and those who could fled the city in search of safety. With a labor force decimated, economic activity ground to a near standstill. Food shortages and inflation added to the misery, and a general sense of fear and helplessness gripped the survivors. Rumors and superstition flourished in the absence of scientific understanding, and some communities turned to scapegoating, blaming minorities or foreign traders for the disease. And yet, amid this overwhelming tragedy, the plague brought about far-reaching and unexpected changes. In the immediate aftermath, the drastic reduction in population created a labor shortage that shifted the balance of power between workers and landowners. Surviving laborers could now demand better wages and conditions, leading to social and economic shifts that undermined the old feudal structures. In London, the rebuilding process was slow but determined. The city began to reorganize itself, not only physically, but economically and socially. The depopulation of entire neighborhoods made room for structural improvements. Some streets were widened, markets restructured, and living conditions gradually re-examined. The experience also led to changes in public health awareness. Although there was no clear understanding of disease transmission, the link between filth and illness began to influence urban planning in subtle ways. Over the following decades, the city's administration introduced rudimentary health measures, such as quarantines and waste management initiatives. Culturally and psychologically, the Black Death left deep scars. Artistic and religious expressions of the period were infused with themes of mortality, divine judgment, and human fragility. The trauma of mass death also altered relationships between social classes, as many former serfs gained property or positions vacated by their deceased lords and masters. For London, the plague was both a catastrophe and a catalyst, a moment of collapse that paradoxically opened the door to change. By the end of the 14th century, London was a transformed city. Though smaller in population, it had adapted to its losses and set new trajectories in motion. The Black Death had revealed the vulnerabilities of urban life, but it also set the stage for a more flexible and economically dynamic society. In its recovery, London demonstrated the resilience that would become a hallmark of its long and turbulent history. The Wars of the Roses and political unrest. Throughout the 15th century, London found itself at the volatile heart of English political life, caught in the crossfire of a dynastic struggle that would come to be known as the Wars of the Roses. This bitter conflict, which spanned over 3 decades, was fought between the rival houses of Lancaster and York, 2 branches of the royal Plantagenet family, each laying claim to the throne of England. As the nation fractured into shifting alliances and intermittent civil war, London became a crucial pawn in the larger battle for legitimacy, power, and control. The city's political and symbolic weight made it an irresistible prize. Whoever held London had access to the machinery of government, the support of the wealthy merchant classes, and the commanding presence of Westminster and the Tower. As such, both Lancastrian and Yorkist factions vied constantly for influence over the capital. The city's gates were opened and closed to rival claimants depending on the mood of its leaders, the strength of armies on the march, or the outcome of nearby battles. Londoners themselves often found it necessary to play a delicate balancing act, weighing loyalty to the crown against fear of retribution from whichever faction appeared to be gaining the upper hand. The Wars of the Roses officially began in 1455 with the First Battle of St. Albans. But tensions had been simmering for years. King Henry VI, a pious and gentle monarch, was plagued by bouts of mental illness and unable to provide stable leadership. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, fiercely defended her husband's reign, while Richard, Duke of York, positioned himself as the protector of the realm. London quickly became the backdrop for political maneuvering and rebellion, with rival nobles marching through the city, calling parliaments, issuing proclamations, and executing opponents. The Tower of London, already a potent symbol of authority, was frequently used to imprison, torture, or eliminate political enemies. Public executions on Tower Hill and at Smithfield drew crowds and sent chilling messages to both commoners and nobles. At times, the city erupted into chaos as angry mobs took sides, looted shops, or stormed the homes of suspected traitors. Yet, through it all, London's civic leaders did their best to maintain order and preserve the city's economic stability. The Lord Mayor and aldermen, many of them wealthy merchants and guild leaders, tried to navigate the chaos with pragmatism, ensuring that trade continued and that the city remained functional, even as thrones changed hands. London also played host to moments of high drama and royal theatre. Edward IV, a charismatic Yorkist leader, was proclaimed king in the capital in 1461 and given a grand coronation in Westminster Abbey. Years later, Henry VI was briefly restored to the throne, only to be overthrown once again. Each restoration or deposition was marked by parades, sermons, and declarations, as the claimants used the city to project authority and rally support. In many ways, London became the stage upon which legitimacy was performed, witnessed, and contested. The wars finally drew to a close in 1485 when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth and was crowned King Henry VII. His victory signaled the end of Plantagenet rule and the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. London, weary from decades of uncertainty, welcomed the prospect of stability. Under Henry VII's careful consolidation of power, the city was rewarded with renewed royal attention, economic support, and relative peace. Yet the legacy of the Wars of the Roses lingered. The political turbulence of the 15th century had exposed the fragility of the monarchy and the volatility of noble ambition. London, having survived factional rule, sieges, and shifting loyalties, emerged not only as the kingdom's capital, but as a seasoned and resilient city, one that had learned to endure upheaval and adapt to the dangerous tides of power. The Tudor era and London's expansion. The 16th century ushered in a period of profound transformation for London, as the Tudor dynasty reshaped not only the political structure of England, but the very fabric of its capital. Under the long and eventful reigns of Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth I, London evolved from a medieval city into a burgeoning early modern metropolis, its skyline changing, its population swelling, and its influence radiating far beyond its ancient walls. At the beginning of the Tudor period, London was already the kingdom's primary city, but it was still relatively compact, clustered within and just beyond the remnants of the old Roman wall. By the end of the century, the population had more than doubled, driven by a combination of economic opportunity, rural migration, and the increasing centralization of royal power. Streets that had once been modest lanes filled with timber-framed houses became crowded and chaotic thoroughfares as merchants, artisans, laborers, and nobles all competed for space in the ever-growing capital. One of the most consequential developments of this era was the English Reformation. Initiated by Henry VIII's break from the Roman Catholic Church in the 1530s, the Reformation was both a religious and political revolution, with London at its epicenter. The king's decision to dissolve England's monasteries not only severed ties with the Pope, but also triggered a massive redistribution of wealth and property. In London, monastic lands and buildings were seized, sold off, or repurposed, opening up vast areas for urban development. Entire districts, such as those once occupied by the Blackfriars and Greyfriars, were transformed into residential and commercial spaces, fueling the city's expansion. The dissolution also marked a shift in the city's religious landscape. Dozens of churches, chapels, and religious houses disappeared, while newly reformed parishes and institutions emerged in their place. The cultural life of the city, once dominated by ecclesiastical traditions, began to reflect a more secular and dynamic character. Royal proclamations, Protestant sermons, and the printing press became key instruments in shaping public opinion and political discourse, with London as the main conduit through which these messages flowed. Commerce, too, flourished as never before. The rise of a merchant class and the growth of overseas trade turned London into a hub of international exchange. The riverfront bustled with activity as ships arrived bearing goods from Europe, the Levant, and the Americas. Companies such as the Muscovy Company and, later, the East India Company had their origins in this period, signaling London's growing role in global exploration and commerce. Markets expanded, guilds adapted to new economic realities, and banking and finance began to take root in the city's business culture. Elizabeth I's reign, in particular, was a golden age for London. The Queen understood the importance of the capital not only as a seat of power, but as a cultural and symbolic centre of the English nation. Under her patronage, the city's art scene blossomed, and its political institutions gained further stability. Though London remained vulnerable to disease, fire, and occasional unrest, it emerged from the 16th century with a new sense of confidence and identity. By the century's end, London was no longer simply a large English city. It was becoming a European capital of significance, brimming with ambition, complexity, and contradictions. Its expansion was driven by both opportunity and upheaval, rooted in tradition, yet open to innovation. The Tudor period had transformed London from a medieval town into a rising modern power, setting the stage for the cultural and political revolutions that would soon follow. Shakespeare and the Cultural Renaissance. In the closing decades of the 16th century and the early years of the 17th, London experienced a cultural flowering that would leave an indelible mark on world history. This period, often referred to as the English Renaissance, saw the capital become a vibrant centre of artistic innovation, intellectual exploration, and literary brilliance. At the very heart of this cultural revolution was the rise of the public theatre, and no figure looms larger over this golden age than William Shakespeare. London's rapid expansion under the Tudors had created a populous and increasingly literate urban society, eager for entertainment and ideas. As the economy grew and social mobility increased, so too did public appetite for drama, poetry, and performance. Theatre, once limited to church morality plays or private court masques, moved decisively into the public sphere. Purpose-built playhouses sprang up around the city, especially south of the Thames in Southwark, where looser regulations allowed for greater creative freedom. Among these venues, the Globe Theatre, opened in 1599 by Shakespeare's acting company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, became an iconic fixture of the London cultural landscape. Its circular, open-roof design could accommodate thousands of spectators, from aristocrats seated in covered galleries to working-class groundlings standing in the yard. Performances were lively, communal experiences where audiences laughed, gasped, and wept openly, immersed in the power of language and story. Shakespeare's plays, whether histories, tragedies, comedies, or romances, spoke to a wide range of people. His works, engaged with the political anxieties of the day, explored the depths of human emotion and celebrated the richness and strangeness of the English tongue. In plays like Henry IV and Richard III, he dramatized the nation's past. In Hamlet, Macbeth, and King Lear, he plumbed the psychological complexity of ambition, madness, and mortality. In Twelfth Night and A Midsummer Night's Dream, he conjured a world of wit, illusion, and theatrical joy. But Shakespeare was not alone. This era also witnessed the rise of other great playwrights, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, Thomas Dekker, each contributing to a flourishing literary culture that made London the epicenter of English drama. Theatres such as the Rose, the Curtain, the Swan, and later the Blackfriars offered a variety of styles and voices, enriching the cultural life of the city and making live performance a defining feature of urban entertainment. Print culture, too, was booming. London publishers produced plays, pamphlets, poetry, and prose in unprecedented numbers. The printing of Shakespeare's first folio in 1623 helped preserve his work for future generations, but it was also part of a larger phenomenon in which ideas were circulated quickly and widely, reaching audiences across social and geographic boundaries. Despite occasional outbreaks of plague that closed the theatres and suspicions from Puritan moralists who viewed stagecraft as frivolous or corrupting, the theatrical world thrived. The city's cultural renaissance was not confined to elite courts or scholarly academies. It was popular, public, and profoundly democratic in its reach. By the time of Shakespeare's death in 1616, London had secured its status as a cultural capital. The achievements of this era did more than entertain. They shaped the English language, influenced generations of writers, and offered a mirror through which the people of the time could reflect on themselves and their world. In the smoky air of Elizabethan and Jacobean London, amid the bustle of markets and the roar of the Thames, the stage became a space where imagination reigned and where the soul of the city came alive. The Great Plague. In 1665, London was once again gripped by terror as a deadly outbreak of bubonic plague swept through the city. Though plague had been a recurring presence in Europe for centuries, this particular epidemic, later known as the Great Plague, was the worst London had seen since the medieval Black Death. Over the course of just a few months, the disease claimed the lives of an estimated 100,000 people, nearly a quarter of the city's population, bringing urban life to a near standstill and leaving deep psychological and social scars. The first signs of the outbreak appeared in the spring in the poorer, densely populated districts of the city. By summer, it had spread rapidly through the narrow streets and alleys, carried by fleas on rats and exacerbated by crowded living conditions and inadequate sanitation. The heat of the season only worsened the crisis. Whole households were infected within days. In an effort to contain the disease, officials ordered the doors of plague-stricken homes to be marked with red crosses and the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Those inside were forcibly quarantined, often without access to food or medical help, left to live or die in isolation. Public fear turned quickly to panic. As the death toll mounted, the rhythm of the city broke down. Theaters closed, markets emptied, and businesses were shuttered. Many who could afford to do so fled to the countryside, including much of the nobility, the royal court, and many physicians. King Charles II and his court relocated to Oxford, leaving behind a city gripped by fear and governed by a skeleton administration. Those left behind, often the poor and working classes, bore the full brunt of the disaster. The scale of mortality overwhelmed the city's infrastructure. Traditional graveyards quickly filled, and large plague pits were dug to accommodate the mounting dead. Nightly cart processions carried bodies through the streets, accompanied by the haunting cry of "Bring out your dead." The air was thick with the smell of disease and decay. In desperate attempts to cleanse the air, citizens lit fires in the streets or carried sweet-smelling herbs, though none of these measures had any real effect. Despite the efforts of parish officials, watchmen, and clergy, little could be done to stop the spread. Treatments ranged from ineffective to dangerous, and the medical understanding of disease remained rooted in outdated theories of miasma and imbalance. Even so, detailed accounts of the plague's impact were kept by some contemporaries, most notably Samuel Pepys, whose diary provides a vivid and personal insight into the atmosphere of despair and confusion that engulfed the city. By the autumn of 1665, the outbreak finally began to subside, possibly due to the onset of cooler weather and the natural decline of the infection cycle. But the damage was already done. Whole neighborhoods had been emptied, trade had collapsed, and thousands of families were left grieving. The Great Plague marked the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in London, but its memory lingered for generations, shaping how the city viewed public health, disease, and mortality. In the aftermath, Londoners returned cautiously to their lives, rebuilding what had been lost and trying to make sense of the devastation. Though life resumed, the events of 1665 were never far from memory. The city had survived, but not unchanged. The Great Plague served as a grim reminder of the fragility of urban life in the face of nature's wrath, and it would not be long before another disaster, this time made of fire, not disease, would test London's resilience once again. The Great Fire of London. In the early hours of September 2nd, 1666, a small spark in a bakery on Pudding Lane ignited one of the most devastating events in London's history. What began as a simple fire quickly grew into an uncontrollable inferno, fed by high winds, dry timber buildings, and narrow medieval streets. Over the next 4 days, the Great Fire of London raged through the heart of the city, reducing vast swathes to smouldering ruins. By the time it was finally extinguished, some 13,000 homes, 87 churches, and countless businesses and public buildings had been destroyed, including the iconic St. Paul's Cathedral. The city was utterly transformed. Thousands were left homeless, huddling in tents or escaping to the fields outside the city walls. The fire had leapt from house to house, driven by wind and fanned by wooden overhangs and flammable building materials. Firefighting methods were primitive at best. Buckets of water, fire hooks, and the demolition of buildings to create fire breaks. Despite efforts by citizens and officials alike, the blaze consumed much of the medieval city, stopping only when winds died down and fire breaks finally held. Miraculously, the death toll was low compared to the scale of destruction. Only a few official fatalities were recorded, though the true number is likely higher and obscured by incomplete records. Still, the material loss was staggering. Entire parishes vanished. Markets, warehouses, and shops were obliterated, disrupting the economic lifeblood of the city. Historic buildings, artworks, and documents were lost forever. For many, it seemed as though London itself might never recover. Yet the fire also marked a turning point. In its aftermath, the city had a rare opportunity not only to rebuild, but to reimagine itself. Within days, proposals were being put forward to redesign London with wider streets, open public spaces, and more fire-resistant materials. Though many of the most ambitious plans proved too costly or impractical to implement, a number of critical reforms took root. New building regulations required houses to be constructed of brick and stone rather than timber, and streets were laid out with greater attention to spacing and accessibility. At the centre of the rebuilding effort was the architect Sir Christopher Wren, who was tasked with designing a new St. Paul's Cathedral, along with dozens of parish churches. His vision helped define the new skyline of London, one characterised by domes, spires, and classical lines. Wren St. Paul's, completed decades later, would become not only a religious centre, but a symbol of the city's resilience and renewal. The fire also led to improvements in urban management and the emergence of a more centralised approach to civic planning. The Corporation of London played a central role in coordinating reconstruction, and Parliament passed laws to facilitate property disputes, loans, and new construction guidelines. While the medieval character of London was largely erased, what emerged was a city better prepared for the demands of the modern world. For Londoners who lived through it, the Great Fire was a traumatic, defining experience. It followed closely on the heels of the Great Plague, compounding the sense of loss and instability. Yet, it also revealed the city's remarkable capacity for adaptation. Out of ashes and ruin, a new London began to rise, one more orderly, more durable, and ultimately more visionary. The Great Fire did not destroy London's spirit. It forged a new version of it, one that would continue to grow in stature and strength for centuries to come. Eighteenth century growth and industrial change. By the 18th century, London had entered a new phase of transformation, one defined not by war, plague, or fire, but by unprecedented growth and economic dynamism. As the capital of a rising imperial power and the heart of a nation on the cusp of industrial revolution, London rapidly expanded in both scale and complexity. It became the largest city in Europe, a sprawling urban landscape teeming with opportunity, inequality, invention, and ambition. At the dawn of the century, London's population stood at around 600,000. By 1800, it had more than doubled, surpassing 1 million residents. This demographic explosion was fueled by a variety of forces: a steady influx of migrants from rural England and beyond, declining mortality rates, and the rising demand for labour. The city's physical footprint grew accordingly. Once limited to the area within and just outside the medieval walls, London now spread outward in every direction. New suburbs and neighbourhoods emerged in places like Marylebone, Southwark, and Spitalfields, absorbing the ever-growing population and reshaping the city's geography. Economically, London was becoming the engine of a global empire. Its port was the busiest in the world, with ships constantly arriving and departing along the Thames, carrying goods from the Caribbean, North America, India, and Africa. Warehouses brimmed with sugar, tea, tobacco, textiles, and other commodities that fed a consumer revolution across Britain and Europe. Banks, stockbrokers, and insurance companies clustered around the city, creating the foundations of a modern financial system. The Bank of England, established in the previous century, solidified its central role in both national and international finance. The early stages of the Industrial Revolution also began to make their mark on London. While heavy industry would become more associated with cities in the north of England, London remained a hub of light manufacturing, skilled trades, and innovation. Printing, tailoring, metalworking, and furniture making all thrived in workshops and factories scattered across the metropolis. Inventions and scientific progress were supported by institutions like the Royal Society, while new technologies slowly altered the rhythms of daily life. Yet this period of explosive growth came with profound challenges. The expanding population strained infrastructure and services. Housing conditions for the poor were often deplorable, overcrowded, unsanitary, and vulnerable to disease. The contrast between wealth and poverty became increasingly stark, visible in the proximity of opulent townhouses and squalid tenements. Crime, homelessness, and pollution became pressing urban concerns. The city streets were lit by oil lamps, and its air was thick with coal smoke from countless chimneys. Efforts to address these problems emerged alongside the expansion. Philanthropic societies, religious charities, and reformers began advocating for education, healthcare, and improved housing. Urban planning started to gain attention, with new squares, parks, and thoroughfares developed to impose some order on the chaotic sprawl. Westminster Bridge was completed in 1750, improving access across the Thames, and new roads and turnpikes connected London more efficiently to the rest of the country. Culturally, London thrived. It was a city of coffee houses and newspapers, theatres and salons. The 18th century saw the rise of modern journalism and political debate, with publications like The Spectator and The Times reaching a broad and engaged readership. Artists such as William Hogarth captured the contradictions of urban life, while writers like Samuel Johnson, Daniel Defoe, and later Jane Austen contributed to a rich literary landscape. Intellectual and social life flourished in clubs, lecture halls, and public gardens, giving London a reputation as a city of both learning and spectacle. By the end of the century, London was no longer just the capital of England. It was a global metropolis, central to the workings of empire and commerce, and emblematic of both the promise and perils of modern urban life. The growth and change of the 18th century laid the groundwork for the even more dramatic transformations of the Victorian era, as London prepared to enter the industrial age in full force. Victorian London and the British Empire. In the 19th century, under the long reign of Queen Victoria, London reached the height of its global influence and began to resemble the modern city we recognize today. It became not only the political and economic capital of Britain, but the symbolic heart of the world's largest empire. At the peak of imperial power, London governed, traded with, and influenced vast territories across every continent, from India to Africa, from Canada to Australia. The sheer scale and wealth of the empire flowed visibly through the city streets, docks, and institutions, giving London an aura of unmatched authority and ambition. The population surged with extraordinary speed. From just over 1 million at the start of the century, London swelled to over 6 million by its end, making it the most populous city in the world. The expansion was driven by industrialization, immigration, and rural to urban migration, all feeding a rapidly diversifying urban workforce. This immense growth pushed the city far beyond its historic core, with new suburbs and working-class neighborhoods emerging in every direction. The landscape of London was reshaped as old parishes gave way to boroughs, and once rural villages became absorbed into the metropolis. Key to this transformation was the revolution in transportation. Railways connected London to the rest of the country, bringing in food, materials, and labourers while allowing for the development of commuter suburbs. Within the city, the opening of the Metropolitan Railway in 1863, the world's first underground train, marked a major turning point. The London Underground expanded steadily throughout the century, providing faster travel across the growing capital and helping to knit its fragmented districts into a cohesive whole. Horse-drawn omnibuses and later electric trams complemented this network, changing the rhythm of urban life and accessibility. Alongside its physical expansion, Victorian London was characterized by the creation and growth of major cultural and scientific institutions that embodied the intellectual confidence of the era. The British Museum, originally founded in the 18th century, expanded both its collections and its prestige, becoming a repository of imperial knowledge and artifacts. The Natural History Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the Science Museum followed, forming a cluster of educational landmarks in South Kensington. These institutions reflected not only Britain's technological and scientific achievements, but also the deep, often controversial connections between culture and empire. Economic life flourished, with the City of London solidifying its status as the global centre of finance. The London Stock Exchange grew in importance, and banks based in the city financed international trade, colonial ventures, and industrial development. The docks along the Thames were constantly busy, importing raw materials from around the empire and exporting manufactured goods in return. London's economic reach seemed limitless, and its prosperity was unmatched by any other city in the world. Yet the grandeur of Victorian London stood in sharp contrast to the realities faced by many of its inhabitants. The rapid expansion brought overcrowding, pollution, and stark social inequality. In the East End and other impoverished districts, thousands lived in slums with inadequate sanitation, vulnerable to disease and malnutrition. The writings of Charles Dickens vividly captured this darker side of the city, its street urchins, workhouses, and moral complexities. His novels, along with those of other social critics and reformers, helped raise awareness and spark the beginnings of social change. Despite its contradictions, Victorian London radiated a powerful sense of progress and purpose. It was a city of exhibition halls and crystal palaces, of royal jubilees and gas-lit boulevards, of factories and reform movements, of imperial pride and social awakening. Under Queen Victoria's reign, London embraced modernity while remaining deeply rooted in tradition, shaping a legacy that would continue to define its identity long after the empire itself began to wane. By the end of the century, London stood not only as the capital of an empire, but as a symbol of the age, complex, ambitious, and inexorably forward-moving. Jack the Ripper and the East End. In the autumn of 1888, a series of brutal murders in the East End district of Whitechapel sent shockwaves through London, and soon the world. The unknown killer, who came to be known as Jack the Ripper, targeted vulnerable women, many of them sex workers living in some of the most deprived areas of the city. The crimes were gruesome, calculated, and terrifyingly precise, sparking widespread panic and speculation. But beyond the horror, the Ripper murders drew unprecedented attention to the stark realities of life in London's poorest neighbourhoods and exposed the deep social divisions that had long been ignored by the Victorian establishment. Whitechapel, by the late 19th century, was a byword for urban squalor. It was overcrowded, under-policed, and teeming with poverty, crime, and disease. Thousands of people lived in slum housing and so-called doss houses, temporary shelters where the destitute paid a few pennies for a night's rest, often in unsanitary and unsafe conditions. Unemployment was high, alcoholism was rampant, and many women turned to prostitution as a means of survival. While London's West End gleamed with affluence and progress, the East End remained a world apart, hidden in plain sight. The Ripper murders violently forced that contrast into the public consciousness. Over the course of several months, 5 women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were found murdered in horrific circumstances. The killer's ability to strike undetected, often leaving behind scenes of surgical mutilation, confounded the Metropolitan Police and enraged the public. As fear gripped the East End, media coverage exploded. Newspapers, both in Britain and abroad, published sensational headlines, graphic illustrations, and lurid speculation. For the first time, a criminal case was fed and amplified by mass media, turning Jack the Ripper into a global phenomenon. The response from the public was a mix of fear, fascination, and outrage. Many blamed the police for their failure to catch the killer. Others pointed fingers at the government for neglecting the conditions that had allowed such crimes to occur. The East End's suffering, long invisible to the upper classes, became the subject of intense scrutiny. Journalists, social reformers, and politicians descended on Whitechapel, some out of genuine concern, others in search of scandal. Figures like George Bernard Shaw and William Booth used the moment to highlight the urgent need for social reform, linking the violence to the wider failures of industrial capitalism. The Ripper case also revealed the limitations of Victorian-era policing. Fingerprinting had not yet been introduced, and forensic science was in its infancy. Investigators relied on witness testimony, crude sketches, and rudimentary crime scene analysis. Suspects were interrogated, letters claiming to be from the killer flooded in, and theories proliferated, from deranged doctors to members of the aristocracy. But no arrest was ever made. The killer vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving behind one of the most enduring mysteries in criminal history. Yet the legacy of the Ripper case extended far beyond its unknown perpetrator. It exposed how unevenly London's wealth and security were distributed, and how deeply social neglect could fester in the heart of a supposedly modern city. The murders prompted new debates about urban poverty, women's safety, and the responsibilities of the state. They also changed the relationship between crime and the media, laying the groundwork for the modern culture of true crime reporting. In the years that followed, Whitechapel remained a symbol of both fear and transformation. Charities, churches, and reform movements intensified their efforts to improve housing, employment, and health in the East End. But the memory of Jack the Ripper lingered, casting a long shadow over Victorian London, a reminder of the darkness that could exist within the greatest city of the age. World War II and the Blitz. Between 1939 and 1945, London once again found itself on the front line of history, as the Second World War brought conflict and destruction to its very heart. While Britain had experienced war before, never had the capital itself become such a direct target. During the Blitz, a sustained bombing campaign carried out by Nazi Germany, London endured night after night of air raids that devastated its infrastructure, claimed thousands of lives, and tested the spirit of its people. Yet, amid the rubble and fire, the city became a powerful symbol of national defiance and resilience. The bombing began in earnest on September 7, 1940, and continued with terrifying regularity for 57 consecutive nights. German bombers targeted London's docks, railways, factories, and residential areas in a concerted effort to break morale and cripple the British war effort. Flames engulfed neighborhoods, sirens wailed across the city, and the skyline glowed red as entire streets were reduced to ash. The attacks were indiscriminate. While strategic targets were prioritized, schools, hospitals, and homes were often caught in the destruction. Iconic buildings were damaged or destroyed, including the House of Commons, parts of Buckingham Palace, and countless churches and historic landmarks. Yet, in one of the most enduring images of the war, St. Paul's Cathedral stood tall amid the smoke and ruins, seemingly untouched. This image, captured in photographs and widely circulated, came to embody London's refusal to be cowed by terror. The cathedral's survival, whether by chance or divine fortune, boosted public morale and became a beacon of hope. The human cost was enormous. Tens of thousands of Londoners lost their lives, and many more were injured or left homeless. Families were forced to seek shelter in underground stations, basements, and hastily constructed public bunkers. daily life adapted to the constant threat. Blackout curtains became mandatory, rationing dictated meals, and gas masks were carried as routine. Children were evacuated to the countryside, separating families for months or even years. Despite these hardships, a remarkable sense of solidarity emerged. Communities supported each other, volunteers assisted in rescue efforts, and the city's famously stoic attitude, the so-called Blitz spirit, took hold. The Blitz was not the only threat London faced during the war. From 1944, the city came under attack from V-1 flying bombs and later V-2 rockets, Germany's early foray into long-range missile technology. These silent, sudden strikes caused further fear and destruction, but by then, the British public had grown hardened to the constant danger. Even as bombs fell, London carried on. Theatres reopened, factories worked around the clock, and Parliament continued its business in makeshift chambers. The endurance of ordinary Londoners became a quiet act of rebellion. The leadership of Winston Churchill further galvanized the city. His speeches, often delivered from Westminster, rang through radios across the capital, urging perseverance and defiance. His declaration that we shall never surrender found a particular resonance in the battered streets of London. The capital had become more than a city. It was the frontline symbol of a free nation standing alone against tyranny. When the war ended in 1945, London emerged victorious but deeply scarred. Entire districts had been reduced to rubble, historic sites damaged, and thousands of lives lost. The city faced the immense challenge of reconstruction, both materially and emotionally. Yet it had also undergone a transformation. The war had fostered a renewed sense of unity, strengthened civic resolve, and accelerated social and political change, including growing support for the creation of the welfare state. In the face of unimaginable destruction, London had not only survived, it had become a rallying point for the Allied cause and a global symbol of resistance. The Blitz did not break the city, it steeled it. The scars remained, etched into the buildings and memory of its people, but so too did the pride and resilience that defined one of the darkest and yet most defining chapters in London's history. Post-war rebuilding and immigration. In the aftermath of World War II, London stood damaged yet determined, scarred by years of bombing, but buoyed by the collective resilience that had carried it through the conflict. As Britain emerged into peacetime, the capital faced an immense challenge: to rebuild a shattered city while addressing deep social needs in a rapidly changing world. Over the following decades, from the late 1940s through the 1970s, London would be transformed once again, not only physically through reconstruction and development, but culturally and demographically, as immigration from across the former British Empire reshaped the city's identity. The physical rebuilding of London began almost immediately. Entire neighborhoods had been destroyed during the Blitz, and housing shortages were acute. The government embarked on an ambitious program of construction, creating new housing estates, public buildings, and transport infrastructure. Prefabricated homes offered temporary relief, while large-scale urban planning projects aimed to modernize the city's layout. The 1950s and 1960s saw the rise of modernist architecture, tower blocks, concrete estates, and new civic centers designed to address both the housing crisis and the egalitarian aspirations of the post-war era. Transport infrastructure was expanded and improved. The underground network was extended, roads were widened, and new motorways were built to accommodate the growing use of cars. Iconic structures like the South Bank Centre, built for the 1951 Festival of Britain, symbolized a renewed commitment to culture and public life. London was being rebuilt with a forward-looking spirit, shaped by the optimism of a society eager to leave the traumas of war behind. But rebuilding the city meant more than bricks and concrete. It required people. With labour shortages across industries from transport to healthcare, Britain turned to its colonies and former colonies for help. Beginning with the arrival of the Empire Windrush in 1948, thousands of migrants from the Caribbean, India, Pakistan, Africa and elsewhere were invited to settle in Britain and contribute to its recovery. London became a primary destination, offering both opportunity and the familiarity of an imperial connection. These new arrivals brought with them diverse cultures, religions, languages and traditions. They settled in neighbourhoods like Brixton, Notting Hill, Southall and Hackney, where communities grew around places of worship, shops and cultural centres. Over time, these districts became vibrant enclaves of multicultural life, enriching the social and cultural fabric of the capital. However, the transition was not without difficulty. Many immigrants faced racism, discrimination, and economic hardship. Job opportunities were often limited, housing was inadequate, and hostilities simmered beneath the surface of Britain's post-imperial identity crisis. Despite these challenges, the contributions of immigrant communities were immense. They staffed the newly created National Health Service, drove the buses and trains, and revitalized the service and manufacturing sectors. They introduced new cuisines, music, art, and political perspectives, helping to transform London into a truly global city. The annual Notting Hill Carnival, rooted in Caribbean culture and first held in the 1960s, emerged as a powerful symbol of this new, pluralist identity. At the same time, British society was undergoing broader shifts. The rigid class structure began to loosen, the welfare state expanded, and youth culture challenged traditional norms. London, as always, was at the forefront of these changes, a testing ground for the tensions and possibilities of modern Britain. Social movements, civil rights campaigns, and growing political activism reflected a city grappling with questions of race, identity, and equality. By the end of the 1970s, London had been fundamentally reshaped. Its skyline had changed, its population had diversified, and its post-war mission had evolved from mere survival to renewal and redefinition. The city had risen from the ashes of war not just as a rebuilt capital, but as a place where cultures converged and new identities were formed. The foundation had been laid for the London of the future, complex, multicultural, and global in outlook. Modernization and financial power. From the 1980s through the early 2000s, London underwent a dramatic transformation, emerging as one of the world's most powerful and dynamic financial capitals. This period was marked by rapid modernization, aggressive economic reform, and the reshaping of the city's skyline, all of which reflected a broader shift in Britain's national identity and role on the global stage. At the heart of this change was a drive to reposition London as a hub of international commerce, innovation, and investment, and the results would permanently alter both the physical landscape and the social fabric of the capital. The election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979 ushered in a new era of economic policy. Her government pursued deregulation, privatization, and a free market ideology that stood in stark contrast to the post-war consensus of state intervention. These policies had a profound effect on London, particularly in the financial sector. One of the most consequential developments came in 1986 with the so-called Big Bang, a sweeping deregulation of financial markets that revolutionized the way the City of London operated. Traditional trading practices were abandoned in favor of electronic systems, foreign firms flooded into the market, and the old boy network of British finance gave way to a more global, fast-paced, and competitive environment. The Big Bang unleashed a wave of investment, transforming the square mile into a high-powered, high-stakes financial ecosystem. Banks, insurance companies, law firms, and trading houses expanded rapidly, and demand for office space soared. This demand led to a dramatic shift in London's skyline. While historic buildings and narrow streets still defined much of the city, new steel and glass towers began to pierce the horizon. The skyline, once dominated by church spires, now bristled with cranes and skyscrapers, symbols of economic ambition and corporate success. Another major development was the creation of Canary Wharf in the former docklands of East London. Once a hub of maritime trade, the area had fallen into disuse and decay by the mid-20th century. In the 1980s, it was targeted for redevelopment into a second financial district. Spearheaded by international investors and backed by government support, Canary Wharf rose rapidly, with gleaming office towers and modern infrastructure designed to rival the traditional city. Despite early setbacks, it became home to major banks, media companies, and global corporations, solidifying London's place at the forefront of global finance. These transformations were accompanied by broader modernization efforts. Infrastructure projects like the Docklands Light Railway and upgrades to the underground improved connectivity, while new cultural landmarks, the Millennium Dome, the Tate Modern, and the London Eye, signaled a city embracing both the future and its place as a global tourist and cultural destination. London's international appeal soared, attracting talent, investment, and migration from around the world. But this era of growth and prosperity also had its contradictions. The financial boom created immense wealth, but not all Londoners shared in it. Rising property prices, especially in the newly redeveloped business districts, began to push out working-class communities and deepen inequalities. Gentrification transformed many neighborhoods, while homelessness and poverty remained visible and pressing issues. The deregulated economy fostered innovation and expansion, but also speculation, volatility, and new vulnerabilities, as would be revealed in the financial crisis of 2008. Nevertheless, by the early 2000s, London had firmly established itself as a global powerhouse, a city where money, information, and people flowed freely across borders. It was no longer just the political capital of the United Kingdom, but a magnet for international finance, technology, media, and culture. The skyscrapers of Canary Wharf and the city stood as monuments to this transformation, physical embodiments of a city that had not only adapted to a changing world, but helped shape it. London had become the financial heartbeat of a globalized economy, setting the tone for the 21st century and beyond. '21st century. In the 21st century, London has firmly established itself as one of the most influential and interconnected cities in the world. It is a place where ancient history meets cutting-edge innovation, where centuries-old traditions coexist with dynamic change, and where people from every corner of the globe live, work, and shape the city's future. As the capital of a former empire and a global financial centre, London's identity today is defined not by one single heritage or industry, but by its extraordinary diversity, adaptability, and global reach. Now, home to over 9 million people, London is one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse cities on the planet. More than 300 languages are spoken across its boroughs, and its communities reflect a vast spectrum of nationalities, religions, and traditions. From Bangladeshi enclaves in Tower Hamlets to Nigerian markets in Peckham, from Sikh temples in Southall to Caribbean carnivals in Notting Hill, London's multiculturalism is not just demographic, it is a defining feature of its identity. This diversity fuels creativity and innovation across the city's cultural, culinary, academic, and technological landscapes, making it a magnet for talent and imagination. London remains a centre of global finance, with the city and Canary Wharf continuing to host some of the world's leading banks, investment firms, and financial institutions. It is also a hub for arts, education, and media. Institutions like the BBC, the Royal Opera House, and the British Library carry forward long-standing cultural traditions, while universities such as UCL, King's College, and the London School of Economics attract students and researchers from across the globe. The city's museums, galleries, theatres, and festivals make it a year-round destination for culture and creativity. Yet, alongside its strengths, London faces a complex set of challenges. The decision to leave the European Union in the 2016 Brexit referendum created deep political divisions and uncertainty, especially in a city that voted overwhelmingly to remain. Questions about identity, belonging, and Britain's place in the world have taken on renewed urgency, and London, as a cosmopolitan and outward-looking city, has often found itself at odds with broader national sentiments. In the wake of Brexit, London has had to recalibrate its relationships with Europe and the world, striving to maintain its status as a global gateway in a more fragmented geopolitical landscape. Housing is another critical issue. As the city has grown in population and prestige, the cost of living has soared. Affordable housing remains scarce, and gentrification continues to reshape long-standing communities. For many Londoners, especially young people and lower-income families, the dream of home ownership or even stable rent has become increasingly distant. The tension between economic opportunity and social inequality persists as one of the defining paradoxes of modern London. Climate change and environmental sustainability have also become central concerns. As a densely populated urban environment, London faces rising risks from air pollution, extreme weather, and energy consumption. In response, the city has embraced green policies, expanding public transportation, promoting cycling, and investing in sustainable architecture. Projects like the Ultra-Low Emission Zone, ULEZ, and the Thames Barrier reflect ongoing efforts to balance growth with environmental responsibility. Despite these challenges, London's influence remains vast. It continues to serve as a stage for political discourse, a crucible of global culture, and a laboratory for new ideas. From world summits to fashion weeks, from tech startups to street-level activism, the city thrives on exchange of people, of capital, of thought. Its global stature is not simply a legacy of the past, but a reflection of its ability to evolve, absorb, and reimagine itself in response to change. In the 21st century, London is not just a city. It is a world in miniature, a place of contradictions and convergences where the past is never far from view and the future is constantly unfolding. It stands not as a finished monument, but as a living, breathing metropolis, restless, resilient, and always in motion.